Hi folks, Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about empires and to make a distinction between empires that extracted or took wealth away from the conquered or occupied territories, and empires that created new wealth. And there's an important distinction here to be made. Now, we see certainly in the modern times with the globalist, very frantic and aggressive globalist attempt to eradicate all white culture and history, we find that the very successful British Empire is under assault. They invented slavery, so it's alleged. That they're bad, they're evil, they're all Hitler and they're all Nazis and have to pay compensation. Nothing more evil than a straight white guy, and so on and so forth. So very much the globalist mantra these days. None of it's true, however, but who cares? When you're reshaping society, any lie is permissible, or so the globalists believe. Now, if we look at ancient empires, and there's an endless amount of empires: the ancient Assyrian Empire, the ancient Persian Empire, Babylonian Empire, Egyptian Empire. The list just goes on and on. These empires, Ottoman Empire, again, I can go. The white empires actually came very late to the game, and other than the Roman Empire, is one of the earlier players. Or I suppose you could say the Greeks through Alexander the Great, but most of these empires were not Western white people. They were brown people, Asian people, and so on. So anyway, let's sort of have a look at the difference between the empires. Now, the traditional way of if you like, the purpose of empire was two things. One was to acquire land where agriculture was prevalent, so you'd conquer your neighbor, and then you would demand that they pay part of their agricultural produce. It could be wheat, could be whatever. They pay that in like as a tax in effect, and they pay that to you. So by conquering them, you actually had the rights from their labor and their production, and but it was wealth that they had built up. So you were conquering another people who had already developed that wealth. Whether that wealth came from better agricultural technology or something like that was sort of beside the point. But they had already created the wealth. These empires weren't going in and saying, okay, you're not doing anything with that land, so let's grow wheat or corn or something like that. That wasn't it. The agricultural production and whatever was already there. Could be pottery or something like that as well. So they would go in and take advantage. The conqueror, if you will, I'll use that term generically. The conqueror would go in and then take wealth, extract wealth that was already there and was already in existence. So they would add nothing to it. They would just come along and say, okay, we're in charge now, and like a protection racket or something, you have to give us part of your produce or part of your production in again, pottery or whatever it might have been. So and there are other sort of odd things, like certain types of sea shells in the Mediterranean from which a certain dye could be extracted, and so you'd conquer those people, and they've got to give you their shells. So trade was an option, but a cheaper, more reliable way of doing it was just to conquer the guys down the road, and you didn't have to pay for it. You could just sort of take it as a bounty, if you will, or again as a tax. Now that was how it was done. So again, just to reiterate, empires were you conquered your neighbor or have many territories, and you took the wealth away from people that already were producing that wealth. Now let's fast forward to say the British Empire. Now the British weren't necessarily completely typical of every empire. The Portuguese and Spanish were quite extractive, but even so, the the wealth they were extracting wasn't of the same value to the natives in South America as it was in Europe. There was no comparison of value there. So the idea that the Spanish or Portuguese should have somehow paid to the South American natives some sort of payment of monies equivalent to the value of, say, gold or silver in Europe, that's just a fanciful pipe dream. The Aztecs and Incas didn't use money in that way. The way they exchanged money was typically with labor. You would go and provide your labor for a day or two, and that would be the equivalent of a tax or paying a debt or whatever. So there wasn't a money exchange economy as we would understand it anyway. But nonetheless, coming now to the British Empire. Now, the British arrived in whether it be Africa or Australia or New Zealand or wherever it was, North America, Canada, and they came across peoples who had nothing even remotely resembling Western technology of the day, not even close. Most of the African places were close to 2,500 years technologically behind the West. In the cases of Australian Aboriginal, even further than that. So huge chasm of technical development and organisational development existed between the two. So when the British arrived in the colonial empire thing, when the British arrived in the area, there was no agriculture. Or if there was agriculture, it's on such a small scale and so seasonal, because the people were primarily hunter-gatherers. So they may grow very quick-growing crops in a certain area on a very small scale, and they had to be quick-growing because the people weren't going to be around that long. And they would eat those, and they would head off to another area, 100 miles away. So there was none of this. So the British established, vast farms and plantations, as say the French did, the sugar cane in the Caribbean as an example, but vast plantations or farms where they turned very arable, good quality agricultural land, they turned it into productive farmland, which it was not previously. So they didn't take that productivity, they didn't take the value of either the labor or the technology or the existing wealth creating structures. They didn't take that from the people. And this is a very, very important distinction to make. Hitherto, that was how empires functioned. You took wealth from, as in extracted the wealth that was already there. So therefore, the ancient empires, the conqueror was taking from the conquered something that was of equal value to both. Now, this is different. The British are coming in and doing something that adding value and creating value in a level and a concept and a scale that the locals can't even comprehend. Now, the same goes for the mines that were in the extraction, say, of iron ore, for example. The local natives had not even the slightest concept of metallurgy, and that they had no technology or means of mining in anything, even roughly equating to the scale that the Europeans could do. Building ports and deep water, port facilities and transport links, the roads, and they had no concept of that sort of technology or those sort of infrastructures. Again, mostly in their African communities, they had a communal ownership concept. So there's very little effort was put into building infrastructure such as a road, because then everyone would own it. So why should you bust your ass building a road when you couldn't extract any benefit from it personally? Therefore, there was almost zero investment in infrastructure unless it was the selling of slaves, and then the black Africans seemed to get rather motivated to capture slaves and sell them off to the Arab slavers and so on. So the Europeans brought a very different concept of empire. Now, you could argue, well, the land has value that the natives own. So the natives owned the land, and the white folks came along and used this land to build farms and plantations or whatever. So, well, that's stealing. Well, again, when you're looking at hunter-gatherer societies, particularly given the amount of, there was only a few 100,000 people lived in the whole of Australia. Fewer people lived in the whole of Australia. White folks turned up than even live in one of the smaller Australian cities. But so this idea of land ownership again wasn't something that the natives had. They couldn't conceive of it. They were hunter-gatherers that may not come back to a certain area for years, given that they were roaming around. In Australia's case, well, North America too, they were roaming around the vast countryside. So a lot of these people were at Stone Age level of, the idea of a contract and purchase of land or land ownership, private ownership was something they had no concept of. Things were owned communally because no time was invested in creating anything of value. So things were communally owned. So if they, killed a couple of, kangaroos or something for dinner that night, then the whole tribe would share. It would be a communal thing. So because private property wasn't a thing in most of these places, whether it be North America or Australia and most of Africa, there wasn't the same concept of private ownership, investment in private property. So they didn't, the iron ore that was so valuable to the Europeans was just a piece of rock to the natives. They had no value. It had no value to them. So nearly all the things the Europeans were taking, not everything, it wasn't a perfect thing, nearly everything that the Europeans were taking that they typically were having to invest considerable sums of money in transport and mining and other technologies that only the Europeans had, then that had no value to the natives. So this wasn't something where, as in the ancient empires, where the value of what was being taken was of equal value to the conquered and the conquerors. This is something very different again. The conquerors are coming in and adding value. They're creating new wealth. So the value to the native and the value to the European were poles apart, a gazillion miles apart. Now the natives didn't mind. Hey, I wouldn't mind some of that wheat or that mealie. That's good. So they're not objecting because it's producing food that hitherto didn't exist, and which in turn led to population increases in among their population. But when the British came and started putting railways in and roads and ports and mines and large scale farming, large scale irrigation, transport systems, various other technologies and so on, this was bringing new technology and new productivity to the area. The British were not extracting what was already there. They were bringing technology and creating wealth, and then using that wealth that they had created. Now, this is a very important distinction here. Now, again, going back to the sort of the traditional empire, the only two sources of wealth, if you will, were labour and land that other people already developed and were growing, using agriculturally. But this is the Europeans are now doing something different, often because of their greater levels of technology. The other thing that the Europeans were doing was trade. They're the only ones that had the technology to do long ocean haul. Now, this long ocean voyages. Now, this meant that in areas where the empire didn't penetrate, that local producers could sell their wares, their produce, now all around the world, courtesy of the British transport system that was technologically, way in advance of anything that the locals had, the local natives might have had in any given area. The amount of export from India, for example, as a result of British transport, increased massively, and that simply wouldn't have happened if the Europeans hadn't been there with their advanced marine technology. So these are so I see a huge distinction between the modern empire typified by the British and by the ancient empires, where conquest and grabbing slaves was the only source of wealth. There wasn't anything else, or labour. Whereas the British were adding wealth. Sure, there was the labour exchange, which we now see as slavery. But remember, at the time, slavery, which had been practiced since day one by every empire that's ever existed, that slavery was seen quite different. It was seen as a source of labour that the African chieftains would fall over themselves to enslave their fellow citizens and sell them off to the Europeans or to the Arabs or to anyone else. So we need to sort of understand the labour exchange attitude to slavery of the time, which had been the case in, for thousands upon thousands of years. I'll talk just a moment about the Roman Empire, because they were probably one of the first empires that certainly I can see that were adding wealth where they went. Now, they didn't add wealth wherever they went. For example, they sort of invaded Egypt and told the Egyptians that they had to ship a certain amount of grain to Rome. Egypt was sort of the granary, if you like, of the Mediterranean basin back in the day. And it still produces a lot of grain and various other agricultural products. So that, but the Romans conquered and negotiated, rather one-sided contracts typically for grain. But if they didn't pay enough, then there'd be no incentive, and the farmers would grow something else or not grow as much or that sort of thing. So the Romans had to sort of tread somewhat delicately there. But if you look at, say, the Romans were mining tin out of Britain as a case in point around Cornwall, and or sort of eastern Cornwall, Devon, were mining tin there. Now the tin had no value to the locals. Only the Romans had that advanced sort of metallurgy at the time. So the value to the locals was almost non-existent, whereas it had a much higher relative value to the Romans. Now the same goes for quite a few things there, but the Romans were wherever they went, they were building the aqueducts. They were building buildings with a level of technology the locals had no concept of. The Roman engineering, also irrigation and crop production, draining swamps to allow for irrigation. This was technology the Romans had that hardly anyone else had. So they were able to go to areas that were swamp plains and turn them into productive farmland. Things like that. They were also able to, because they had rudimentary pumping technology, they were able to mine various ores and metals to a depth that the locals could never have considered. And the Romans put this technology all around. What's stunning when the Middle Ages came along is how so much of that technology disappeared from Western Europe and elsewhere, and how it didn't really start to reappear until the 1700s. So almost 1,200 years where this technology not so much disappeared completely, but was employed in such a minimal scale in comparison to the Roman times. It represented almost a complete disappearance of some of those technologies. Not all, but many of them. So I just want to draw that distinction between the empires, just to point out that the British Empire in particular, and it's notable in that sense, created vast wealth around the world, wealth that otherwise would not have existed. And this is because of the ingenuity, organizational capacity, and as much as anything, the advanced technology, but also going into areas where there was, that were thousands of years technologically behind where the British were, and suddenly be able to create all this new wealth that the local inhabitants could never have dreamed of. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.